Good afternoon. My name is Gillian Balaban, and I am Senior Coordinator Governance Relations at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym, the GSSB, held on 20 July 2023. This virtual meeting is being hosted from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded, and you can find the audio recording on the GSS webpage, along with the high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastian Buck, Chief of Standards, Camilla Terran Arameo, Team Assistant Standards, Claire Dugan, Senior Manager Standards, and Tamar Zylstra, Senior Manager Standards. We'll now start with a roll call. Anna Nefedova.
Present.
Corley LaRue.
Present.
Chalandra De Silva.
Present.
Deborah Ing.
Present.
Galia Tsunkova.
Present.
Gangacharan Sharma.
Present.
Dula Genuwadi.
Present.
Jeff Robertson.
Present.
Laura Dana Carter.
Present.
Thank you. Peter Colley.
Present.
And GSSB Chair Carol Adams.
Present.
Thank you, everyone. GSSB members Joseph Martin and Kin Schumacher will join shortly, and GSSB members Jennifer Prinsing and Vincent Kong sent their apologies. I'll now hand over to the Chair, Carol Adams, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and welcome everybody. Our first item is to approve the minutes of the previous meeting. Now, Deborah did send in a suggested rewording for lines 38 to 40, really just for clarification, to state that a risk and opportunity can be both from the impact a company has on the environmental society, as well as an impact from the environmental society on the company. Did anybody have any comments on that? Can we approve that rewording? If there's no comments, I will assume that we can approve that rewording. Okay, thank you. And are there any other comments on the minutes of the previous meeting? Okay, we'll take those as approved with that amendment then. Thank you very much. And that takes us on to our second item, the project for financial services, the proposed members for the Insurance Technical Committee, which Claire Dugan is leading. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Carol. And just to clarify that today we will be submitting the nominations for all three technical committees as part of the sector standard project for financial services. So that's the insurance, the banking, and the capital markets. And perhaps just as a reminder for our newer members, this is a portfolio project. That means it will see the development of three separate sector standards, one for banking, one for insurance, and one for capital markets. And just to given the commonalities and the overlap across these three sectors, it was approved that they be developed under the umbrella of a single project. I think we can go to the next slide. So I'll just give a very short status update before giving an overview of the nominations to the technical committees. This project was approved by the GSSB in February this year. We're submitting the nominations for three technical committees for consideration to the GSSB today. We hope to hold the first technical committee meetings at the end of September, subject to the committee approval, and then we need to confirm availability for that date with the members once they are approved. And looking further down the line, we're aiming for a public exposure of the 3 standards in Q4 of 2024. So next slide, please. I'll just give a very high level overview of the nominations for the technical committees. Obviously, the GSSB have received details of these nominees already, so we'll keep it very high level today. Before I jump into the banking technical committee nominations, I just want to extend a thank you to everyone that supported with this process. Various GSSB members assisted in identifying and making connections, as did many people within the standards division. And on the other side of GRI, the policy team, the community team, and the regional networks were also extremely helpful in identifying and making connections with these experts. In terms of the Banking Technical Committee, we have 6 nominees from the business enterprise constituency, 1 from civil society, 2 from investment institutions, 3 from mediating institutions, and 1 from a labour organisation. I think we have quite solid geographical representation here. I guess the one thing I'd point out, we might be slightly light on the civil society constituency in this technical committee. It was not easy to fill that, but we've made an effort to bring more of this perspective into the peer review group, which I'll go over in a few slides. So I do believe between the peer review group and the representative that we have here, we will have adequate representation of civil society for this sector. Next slide, please. Now, a high-level overview of the Capital Markets Technical Committee. We have 3 nominees in the business enterprise constituency, 2 from civil society, 5 from the investment institutions, 2 from mediating institutions, and 1 from a labour organisation. Again, I think we've achieved quite broad geographical representation here. We definitely have a greater leaning to the investment constituency on this group, and that simply represents the fact that this is a very relevant perspective for this particular sector standard. And moving on to the overview of the Insurance Technical Committee, we have 5 nominees in the business enterprise constituency, 2 from civil society, 2 from investment institutions, 2 from mediating institutions, and 1 from a labour organisation. I'll just finish going over this slide, Corley, and then I'll take your question. I think on the face of it, this particular technical committee might seem to have not quite as much geographical representation as the other 2. So I just want to zoom in on a couple of the nominees who I believe bring truly a global perspective and can even access the perspectives of a couple of regions that may appear that we don't have representation from. So the CEO of ICMIF, this is an industry body within the insurance sector. It has over 200 members from 60 countries. The CEO has been with ICMIF for 28 years, has been the CEO for almost 20 years, and I believe can really represent the perspectives of all those 200 members. And that's truly a global group. Similarly, the program lead from Principles of Sustainable Insurance, that's in the Mediating Institutions group. Principles of Sustainable Insurance is a signatory body with 150 signatories from all over the world. So again, they can bring this perspective. And finally, we have 1 representative in the investment institution constituency who has been categorized as North American, but is from Latin America, worked there for S&P Global for many years before relocating to North America. So they can bring a huge amount of Latin American knowledge and perspective as well. Corley, I'm happy to take your question.
Thanks, Claire. It's a very quick one, actually.
Sure.
I noticed and well done for pulling these committees together. I think they look great in terms of experience and expertise and distribution. I noticed in the insurance committee there is a representative from the Swiss exchange, but they have background in insurance. So I was just wondering, are they there because of their involvement with insurance? Or, you know, would they also be providing input into the Capital Markets Committee, for example?
Yeah, very good question. We felt that they brought interesting expertise from two areas. One, the investor perspective coming from the Swiss Stock Exchange. So definitely bringing that, and hence why they have been categorized to represent the investor constituency. But it was an added bonus for us that they also had prior experience in the insurance sector. And so this sort of made it an even more appealing nomination. You've touched on something there that I also want to bring up, Corley, which is that what's special or unique about this particular project is that we're actually going to bring the three TCs together at various points throughout the development of these standards to make sure we're aligning where possible on common topics. There are a number of companies that operate in more than one of these sectors. So gaining as much alignment as possible is going to be crucial. And there's a number of individuals in these technical committees that bring experience from more than one of these sectors. And I think through these cross-sector exchanges, when the three committees come together, we can really leverage where we have those experts that have overlaying experience. I hope that answered your question, Corley.
Yes, thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Great. And then just coming to my very last slide, I think, which is exactly, I just wanted to quickly go over the peer reviewers that we've compiled so far for this project. You can see here that we've got some very strong civil society representation, BankTrack, Share Action, World Benchmarking Alliance. While BankTrack will only perform a peer review for the banking sector standard, Share Action and World Benchmarking Alliance will perform it for all three. Then we have two from the mediating institution constituency. We have the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network from the IFC. This is a fantastic network which represents financial regulators from all over the world. They were also extremely supportive in making connections for us on this project. They are willing to review all three sector standards, as is the team from the OECD that specializes in the financial sectors will also review all three. And finally, we have two representatives from the investment institutions, that being the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change and the International Capital Markets Association. And both of these reviewers will undertake reviews of the capital market sector standard. I believe that brings this overview to an end. So I'm happy to take any questions and hand back to Carol.
Thank you very much, Claire, for all the work that's gone into that and for your presentation. Are there any further questions of Claire? Okay, then I'd like to ask whether we are ready to approve these committees. Does
Carol?
anybody have? Yes.
Carol, sorry, it's Jill. I've just had a message from Joseph that he unfortunately will not join G20 events going over, and Kim has not joined either. So unfortunately, we don't have quorum at this moment.
Yes, as I thought. Thank you. That's fine. Thank you very much, Jill.
Maybe we can continue.
So can I ask whether those members of the GSSB here approve these committees? So I'll do that by asking whether there are any further questions or any objections. Okay, and hearing none, we'll take it that the GSSB members present are happy to approve these committees. Thank you very much. And so then that takes us to the next item, the sector standard project for textiles and apparel, which Camilla and Bastian are speaking to us about. Welcome.
Yes, thank you, Carol. And I kick us off, and then Camilla will introduce the detail here. Jill, can you move us to the next slide? So we have presented as part of the work program discussions, but also importantly the priorities for this year, the ambition to start the textiles and apparel project. We started it earlier this year with the recruitment phase, but really have a working group gathering and deliberating in September. That was the latest information that you had. Unfortunately, the project lead, Alex, our colleague, has decided to leave GI, which is delaying the schedule for this particular project. And we've had a discussion, Alex and Camilla and the wider team, GI as a whole, has done very significant work to get a group of experts together, and we've discussed whether it was opportune now to confirm the group while we have to replace the position internally to lead the project. And we're today here in front of you to seek approval of the experts slate that we're putting forward, with the idea to start the project then in the first quarter of 24. So we're delaying because we need to backfill a position in the team. We have flagged this to the experts that we're proposing for membership, and they have agreed with this caveat and knowing of this particularity to become part of this project. So I wanted to outline this at the beginning, because I feel it's important, A, that you are notified of the change in schedule, B, also that we have actually vetted this with the experts that we are proposing for approval today. I think this is what I wanted to share at this stage to kick us off. There is also a qualification in terms of the scope of work for which we will seek approval here, as you've seen in the meeting papers. If there are any questions about this, I'm happy to answer them now or also offline if members want further information on this. Otherwise, I would invite Camilla to... Jill, can you move us to the next slide? And Camilla, can you hear?
Yes, I can hear.
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Camila Terán Aramayo. I'm the Sector Standards Division Team Assistant, and I've worked alongside the Textiles and Apparel Project, helping conduct interviews for our working group. And today I have the pleasure of taking you through our final nominations. I'll briefly present the composition, constituencies, and the proposed scope of applicability based on the previous update provided in March. Next slide, please, Jill. Thank you. So our final composition is made up of 19 nominations, plus 2 nominations for the labor constituency, totaling 21 members made up of 16 women and 5 men. To contextualize, we are very proud to announce that our project received almost 200 applications, most applicants originating from the business sector and mostly of North American and European background. And to balance this out, active efforts were successfully made to find candidates from Latin America and civil society. Next slide, please. Thank you, Joe. So to further flesh out the business constituency, the high interest from applicants from individual brands and producing companies that support the development of the standard was reflected across the 100 applicants that were narrowed down to the final 7 shown on the table, favored over very good profiles and resumes that did not match expectations during interviews. And as you can see on the table, our nominations range from individuals working in large brands with specific focus on key areas of the industry, like footwear, to individuals working for medium-sized brands and intermediary producers. And as a reminder, at the outset, applicants do not represent the interests of their respective institutions, but rather apply as individuals with connections to their brand. And to ensure an accurate representation of the industry was adequately reflected in our composition, our key criteria in determining the final selection of nominees included geographical diversity and diversity among positions and experience across the value chain. And in turn, this resulted in a practical exclusion of representatives from industry organizations and initiatives that could multiply the private sector representation as they are promoted or funded by large brands. Interviewees possessed niche areas of expertise like leather, jewelry, circularity, and chemical management. And other interviewees that worked with important stakeholders in the industry were unable to join the working group due to a lack of resources on their end, but expressed interest in remaining part of the process in other capacities. And we've made sure to keep a record of potential peer reviewers based on many interviewees expressing a high level of interest in participating in our public comment period, and even some willing to engage beyond the public comment period to also ensure we retain the large range of perspectives across the industry. And the overarching view was that the textile sector is currently missing a universal reporting tool that spans across all relevant topics to the sector. Next slide, please, Jill. Thank you. With regards to the other constituencies, our biggest challenge was to pursue potential civil society applicants that were not working at ongoing international initiatives funded by the industry. However, we succeeded in counting on individuals working for Solidaridad and Fairwear that possess a global outreach and networks. The final nomination is the Brazilian NGO Fashion Revolution that works on the Fashion Transparency Index that annually ranks large brands' transparency on sustainability that will bring the Brazilian and more generally the Latin American lens that is an area of growing influence in the industry. And for our financial institution constituency, the final 2 nominations currently work in Sustainalytics and Export Development Canada, the former bringing an important perspective made up of a wide range of investors. Finally, our mediating institutions are made up of 7 very experienced consultants, all with over 10 years experience and some with twice the amount. The 2 nominations mentioned on the slide are very insightful independent contractors who have worked both with businesses, but also as service providers, 2 of these from big companies that possess in-depth knowledge about how the industry operates in Africa and Asia. Our nomination that works for the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion is a very experienced professional that will give us access to an immense network in the industry with a particular emphasis on the luxury sector. And the other nomination is an academic lecturing for the University of Virginia Darden School of Business, who holds an impressive in-depth knowledge of global supply chains and their corresponding challenges. At this point, I'll just briefly pause and leave some room for any questions before moving on to our proposed addendum. Yes, Deborah.
Can you hear me? I had to switch headsets.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Just a question. So with the expanded scope to include jewelry, did that have an impact on the working group, or was that sort of considered as part of the working group selection already?
So
It just seems very different than textiles and apparel manufacturing.
Yes.
So
Yes, so after speaking to a couple of potential working group applicants that were specifically interested in the jewelry sector, we did notice that there are some overarching themes across the textiles and the jewelry sector, which is why we figured that it would make more sense to include it in the scope of the facility. So that would be the reason why they have in similar interest in terms of human rights approaches and more social aspects and things like that. And they all share production chains of the value chain and things like that.
okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
Are there any other questions for Camilla? Well, thank you very much, Camilla. It's good to see all the work that goes into selecting these working groups, and great to see the number of really good applications that were received. Thank you for that. Can I ask if anybody has any comments on either the addendum to the project or the working group member proposals?
Carol, I'd just like to note that I just have one more slide that will further also elaborate on the addendum.
On the
if there are
addendum.
further
Okay.
questions anyways.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Okay, well, shall we just first of all ask if those members present approve the working group memberships? Hearing no objections, we'll take that as approved by the members present, and Gillian will follow up with those who are not present after the meeting. So carry on, Camilla. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. So as previously mentioned in March's presentation, our addendum will serve to reflect how our project expands across the apparel industry, given its expansive scope to include jewelry manufacturing and retail, given that it shares stakeholders with the fashion industry and have common sustainability and human rights issues. Two reflections we further ascertained following our interview process. And this would be an appropriate representation of the non-exhaustive definition of apparel that includes all sorts of accessories and jewelry. Additionally, accessories and jewelry are included across sector classifications and in fashion and textile reporting tools and standards, most notably the ESRS sector standards, textiles, accessories, footwear, and jewelry. And more generally, this addendum will just serve as a clarification that makes clear that apparel includes accessories and jewelry rather than a change to the original proposal. So thanks for listening, and unless there are further questions, I'll now hand over to Carol for approvals.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Camilla? Any comments on this addendum? Okay, so unless I hear any objections now, then we'll take that addendum as approved by the GSSB members present just now. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Camilla. And that now takes us to the biodiversity re-exposure on part of the standard, and I'm passing over to Harold and Tamar for that item.
Yes, thank you, Carol. It's very nice to meet you. I started on May 1st as a senior standards manager, so I've not met you yet, but I'm very happy to be in this meeting and tell you a little bit about the re-exposure of the disclosure on access and benefit sharing. Carol just gave me the, okay, Gillian gave me the. So why do we have a disclosure on access and benefit sharing in the biodiversity standards? as part of the Convention on Biological Diversity, they also established targets for 2030. And one of the targets is on access and benefit sharing, and it actually asks to report also, it asks businesses to report also on their efforts to work on, that they do on access and benefit sharing. So when a country has certain genetic resources, if a company or a researcher wants to use those genetic resources, they will want to ask, can we use them? But also they might want to share, or can be asked to share the benefits of those genetic resources and the research that comes from it, or the other benefits that come from it. Parties have asked companies to report on what they're doing with this in this respect, and some countries have implemented legislation for it, and others have not. So it's up to a country to decide: do we have legislation on this? And so this is why we thought, well, we need to include this in the biodiversity standard. As you may remember, we published it. The biodiversity standard was published earlier this year for public comment, and we have received quite a few comments on this specific disclosure. And these are the comments that we received. We've received 46 organizations have commented. We received 123 comments on the disclosure. You can see the constituency of the organizations that have commented. And we found that many comments were on the ABS concept, so it wasn't clear what is access and benefit sharing, ABS ensures. Others said, what is the scope of the disclosure? Is it only legal, or is it beyond legal as well? And a lot of comments were made on the specific requirements, including, for example, because in the previous disclosure that we published earlier this year for exposure, companies or organizations were invited to report on the permits that they have, and many said, well, not every country asks for permits, so it's not really a very good indicator of access and benefit sharing. So I'll walk you quickly through the previous disclosure that we published earlier this year. So under A, it says, well, could you please report the number of permits that you have obtained? And organization said, well, like I said, this isn't a very good indicator because it's not always needed, right? It depends on the country that you're working in. So what does it mean if you have published permits? Same for agreements, because not all countries have legislation. Then under C, monetary and non-monetary benefits, actually C and D, organizations said, well, this is very sensitive information to share, how much monetary and non-monetary benefits we provide when we take genetic resources. And lastly, on E, organizations said, patents has a very different legal dynamic and logic than access and benefit sharing. So it's not very relevant here in this disclosure. So we thought, let's redraft the whole thing. And we've spoken to some of the organizations that have commented, and also to the technical committee. And he explained to us, well, what could be relevant is to have an understanding of how you have organized your compliance with countries that do have legislation, because you need to check whether there is legislation and how you can comply. But it's also very interesting to understand what you do if there is no legislation in place. And this is how we came to these two requirements. So A is we ask organizations to describe the process to ensure compliance. And under B, we ask organizations to describe their voluntary actions if there's no legislation in place, or if they feel they can do more than what the legislation asks. So we would like to publish this because it's quite a big overhaul. We would like to publish this and re-expose it for 6 weeks, from the 26th of July until September 6th. This is a shorter period than what is common for public comment, but it is allowed. So that's why we do think that's a valid time period for organizations to provide us with their comments. We will actively communicate it to all those who have participated in the public comment earlier this year, and we will also announce it in the GRI's newsletter. I don't know if there's any questions.
Thank you very much for that. Are there any questions, comments, Peter, and then Julia?
It is a substantial rewrite, and I can see why it requires further public exposure, public comment period. My question is, well, my first question is, what did the technical committee think of this proposed change? It's my understanding the technical committee is a number of very highly qualified and experienced people. So it seems a little bit surprising that this disclosure needs to be rewritten so substantively. So yes, first question, what did the technical committee think? And secondly, what we've got, the previous draft was a set of data points. The new draft basically doesn't have those data points anymore. Was there any consideration given to a mixture of data points and descriptive process requirements? Thank you.
Yeah, no, these are very good questions, Peter. Thank you. So access and benefit sharing is a very specialized topic, and there are only a few experts in the world actually that know a bit more on the background. So we did consult the technical committee, and there's one expert and she's highly specialized in this topic. She's also part of all the negotiations on this topic. And she explained to us that a bit more about the background, and she also helped us come up with this solution. And we also consulted with an organization that is really commented a lot actually on this disclosure, and they are also part of the negotiations on this topic, and they really helped us come up with this proposal. And because we had, so moving on to the second question, because we had so many comments on the specific information like the permits and agreements and the non-monetary and monetary benefits, and really valid comments on why, you know, it would not be a good parameter to include. Yeah, we discussed with them, and they feel that this makes more sense because it's so different all around the world on what is asked from organizations in different countries. Yeah, so this is why we came to this conclusion of a redraft. But I have to be honest, because of course I thought, where does the information to ask for permit comes from? And it is part of the also the targets that I mentioned on the first slide, but then a different target, and it's more focused on countries and reporting by countries than by individual organizations. And it's for countries, it's also optional whether they want to ask for a permit or whether they have requirements with respect to agreements. Yeah, so it's in that sense, it's really not a very helpful descriptive or data point to really understand what an organization does. So this is how we come to this new draft.
Okay,
I would just thank you.
very
I would
much.
just say that the fact that different countries have different regimes is not of itself a reason not to ask for data. When it comes to occupational health and safety, a lot of data requirements are not specified in law or regulation, or if they are, they're not enforced. But that doesn't stop international standard setters and the GRI asking for OHS data. So it does seem to me to be a shortcoming in the area that that the industry is actually saying this kind of data is beyond us. But I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. Corley. Julia, sorry. You had a question.
Thank you. My first question it was exactly the first question of Peter, and the second one is only related to the practical application of this kind of re-exposure. Consider that normally in Italy and other countries, the month of August is totally holiday. So it's really difficult that you have an answer by Italian companies in this kind of period. I don't know if it's possible to change only 1 week and start a week later and conclude a week later. So we have 2 weeks in September. So we are totally sure that we reach also the comment by other companies in these countries.
Yeah, that's a very valid question. I need to check the agenda. We really wanted to, we decided on this period or proposal for this period because it will allow us to keep the publication date that we had in the time planning. But I don't know if a week will change that. So I will check with that. I will check on that to see if we can, yeah. Are there any other,
Chandra. Oh, sorry, I was on mute.
No.
Can I just go to Harold first, because he may have a point on this last conversation.
Yeah, so first, thanks to Tamar for the explanation, but I sense a little bit the question on why did it change so much. So again, it is a specific topic. So thanks to our process, having a public inquiry, and it's a very specific topic, we came into contact with the International Chamber of Commerce in Montreal, actually, me and Elodie, and we had a long discussion with them, and they were very happy with it. But they say the way you approach it is not the right one, as Tamar was saying. And also our UEB team members, he was in the first instance, we came up with a disclosure before the public inquiry. And in the discussion we had as a group with only 1 or 2 experts, we say, well, this seems fairly good, seems fairly reasonable. Based on these comments, we were able to make it much stronger, and we feel very comfortable. But because the nature of the disclosure is technically somehow changing, so we think it's from a GRI perspective, standards division says we should re-ballot, re-expose it to this specific group, because it's really a specific group of experts, also companies in this International Chamber of Commerce group in this negotiation. So that's, I think, also to Julia. We have a lot of companies also in this group, just to be aware of, who will comment on this. And we will actively commute them by email. Yeah, for the planning, I'm not sure which extending it 1 week, we probably get into conflict with our TC meeting, which we have planned. So well, that's should not be should not influence your decision making. But for us, it's we do not think that we will get other or more comments from other companies, because it's a very specific group we will reach out to. So that's what I want to explain. So there is a good reason why we changed this. We think it's much better, and not to forget, we are the only standard setter at this moment who includes this, and also the group negotiating this in the biodiversity framework, the Kunming one, is really happy with this. So they say, no, please keep it in, but amend it. So that's yeah, that's at least a little bit in addition to the history of how we came to this.
Thanks very much, Harold, for that explanation. Chalendra.
Thanks, Carol. I think just to echo what Peter said as well, I think some quantitative data would be really good to see here. Even though it may be differences in terms of how we collect data from country to country. On the second point, I just want to mention was, given that Thama mentioned that this is actually a very specific or very specialized area with very few technical experts on this field. Maybe just as a suggestion, we should have a sound or a broad guidance of this standard, so that we could basically tell the reporters what needs to get covered, especially under B. I think it'll be relatively clear what comes under A, compliance, but under B, voluntary actions, it might be good to have a good guidance section under the standard to say what a reporter could look at in terms of process improvements or additional things that they could do to what they have.
Thank you. So we have some views that we maybe should consider changing this exposure draft, but an alternative would be to put the exposure draft out and see what comes in from the experts that have been identified that this will be sent to. So I am not quite clear where we are with this. So I guess going back to Peter and Chalendra, are you suggesting that this exposure draft needs to be changed, or are you happy for this to go out as it is? I'll let you think about that and go to Jeff just now.
Sure, thanks, Carol. Thanks, Tamar. Just a quick question, and I thought Peter's comments made a lot of sense, at least to my eye, and I'll fully admit, not an expert in this area. One thought I had that I'm sure was discussed when you were drafting the amendment: could we not compromise a little bit on the permit side? Just because I'm looking at these two items, A and B, and we could have organizations that are totally flouting the law but could write perfectly cogent responses to A and B. So could we maybe on the permit side have something like, report your permits or provide a statement that permits are not a legal requirement in the jurisdictions where you're operating, something like that. Was that kind of a middle ground considered?
No. Yeah, no, that was really strong comments on asking for permits and why it's not the most logical question. And I'm thinking maybe I could dig up get some more precise wording for you on this, so that it's easier to understand why organization thought, well, this is not the best parameter. And why we really, and we got this proposal as well to really change it into the process, and why that's a bit more logical. Maybe that would be an idea. And I'm happy to look at see to come up with a compromise to see if for stronger data points. But then I don't know if we have a lot of support. I don't know, of course, how the organizations will respond to this.
No, and I like I said, Tamar, I fully admit this isn't an area of expertise for me. It just, it's. I thought maybe there's some way, just because I like the idea of it having a little bit of teeth. Like if they're fully in compliance with the law, I want them to have to put it on paper, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's sort of where my comment was coming from. But thanks for the consideration.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So could I hear from those who would could you signal those who would like this to go back for further consideration?
Peter here. Look, I was actually going to let it go to public exposure and see how much feedback we got, perhaps from the other perspectives on the public exposure.
Yeah.
See whether there was a lot of other people saying, no, this is too much of a change. We liked what was already there, or some of what was already there. So I was prepared to let it go to public exposure.
Let it go.
This redraft. And the other point to bear in mind is simply, when we're developing new standards, sometimes we don't achieve everything we want to achieve in the first go. And there's a process of standards evolving, and the industry evolving. So
exactly. Thank you.
That, we can't get it all done in one go.
Thank you. And I am mindful of the time. So Chalendra and Jeff, are you happy for this also to go to exposure draft as it is?
Yep,
yes,
I have the same view as Peter.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, same as Peter and Jeff. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for raising those points. If there are no other comments or objections, I'll take it that the members here approve this exposure draft to go out for further consideration.
Carol, it's Jill. We
Yes.
now have a quorum, so if everyone approves, then this one is done.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, thank you. And that now leaves me, sorry, is that it? Was somebody going to say something else? No?
No.
We're done with that one. Good. Great. All right, thank you. Well, a warm welcome now to Richard Barker from the ISSB, Caroline Clark-Maxwell from the IFRIS Foundation technical team, and Suzanne Drager, a director for strategic projects. And is Romy here as well?
I'm afraid I can't make it, Carol.
Okay, no problem. Well, a warm welcome to you all, and we look forward to hearing now about your S2 and S1 standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Very, very nice to be here for the second time and part of our sort of ongoing and evolving relationship. So this is very good. I have with me, Caroline is the technical lead on S2. So she's the primary author, as it were. And Susanna, who's here somewhere, is our staff lead on the GRI relationship. So what we're going to do is just give you a quick overview of S2 as part of our joint thinking around climate reporting. So I'm going to do a general introduction, and then Caroline's going to add some more depth to it. And somebody out there is driving the slides, I think.
Sorry, I've got my mouth full. Yes, I'm doing it.
Yeah. Okay,
Jill.
keep going. That's an overview of that's the overview of the whole session. Keep going. All right, so just to say something very briefly as a heads up on S2. S2, of course, emerged from an exposure draft back in March of last year, which itself emerged from a prototype that was issued at the time of the ISSB was announced at COP26. And that prototype came out of a working group which included GRI. So this hasn't come from nowhere. In a sense, it's been S2 a relatively, Caroline close you, is a relatively straightforward standard to write because we've been able to build on what's already been out there. S3, I think, will be altogether harder when it comes. So S2 was just launched on the 26th of June, so only just out. Next slide. Okay, and again, so I'm going to just do a brief overview. First thing to say is that S2, we describe S2 as being a natural evolution from the TCFD. So the structure of TCFD is the structure of S2 essentially. And if you're a TCFD reporter already, there should be a very natural development from TCFD into reporting S2. And TCFD, of course, was developed as it were by the market for the market. So this is an investor-oriented standard, as is S2. So 3 bullet points here around meeting investor information needs, focusing on that specific market, as it were. First is that S2 is not a standalone standard. It goes hand in hand with S1. Second is it relates specifically to climate-related risks and opportunities, on which I'll say more. And the third is it requires industry disclosure. Okay, next slide. So in terms of material information, for us, material information is information which is useful for investors in making investment decisions. And we have exactly the same materiality lens as the IASB. This is one of the changes post the exposure draft in S1 was to align the materiality definition exactly. So just to expand upon that, the first bullet point here, the focus is on the risks and opportunities for the company, risks and opportunities that affect the financial prospects of the company and therefore that are of interest to its investors. This, of course, includes reporting impact to the extent that the impact of an entity is a basis for relevant information, material information for investors about risk and opportunity. And of course, not surprisingly, in the climate standard, that impact is defined broadly, as Caroline will get to, scope 1, 2, and 3. Second bullet point, the focus is on understanding how the management's strategic response to its risks and opportunities, including its transition planning. So how climate change is mitigated, how the impacts are mitigated, and also how the business model of the entity is being changed in the light of the risks and opportunities for the entity. Third bullet point, and here's where it starts, I think, to get close to the sister board of ours, the IASB, is focusing on financial effects. And how is the funding of the business able to support the transition plan that it has in mind, for example? How is its business model generating returns for the business and so on? So the more that the disclosures in S2 are able to help investors determine financial effects, the closer it becomes to being an integrated part of information with existing IFRS. Final bullet point, and a point of departure with IASB is, of course, we require disclosures across the entire value chain. It's not possible to understand sustainability-related risks and opportunities otherwise. Next slide. So here's the alignment with S1. It's tempting to look at S2 and think, well, it's a development of TCFD, and therefore it can be taken as an independent standard in much the way that TCFD can. But actually, S1 provides a lot of the important contextual information for S2. So the definition of the reporting entity and the boundaries of the reporting entity, the meaning of materiality, the qualities or characteristics of useful information, comparatives, and how to deal with changes in estimates and errors and so on. So a lot of the oversight information, as it were, is contained within S1. S2 just happens to be the only standard so far that we have developed which expands upon S1. So in the absence of a standard like S2, S1 is the standard that requires all sustainability-related risks and opportunities. So in the current environment for IFRS, there's a lot of weight on S1 because only climate's been drawn out separately. Over time, less and less will be left as a residual in S1 as other standards are developed. So the two go hand in hand. Next slide, please. So TCFD structure, I don't need to introduce. I'm sure it's very familiar to you. And of course, the sort of governance and strategy disclosure is very familiar to you from a GRI perspective as well. I'd like to just say a bit about a couple of these categories of strategy and metrics and targets, and those are in the next slide. So some of the important developments on existing reporting that, again, picking up on TCFD and that are being required in S2 relate to scenario analysis, which is required in our standard, but is required in a proportional way. One of the probably the most significant development between the exposure draft and the final version of the standards has been building in various transition reliefs and accommodations of proportionality. So in the case of scenario analysis, it's required, but it's required at one of three different levels of sophistication. You can have an all singing, all dancing, you're a large insurance company, you can do this kind of stuff, scenario analysis, or it can be entirely qualitative. It can be, we've thought about this, And this is how it's starting to influence the way our board is thinking. That's one important thing to draw out. Another important thing to draw out from here is the industry-based disclosure. So, of course, we've inherited SASB and with SASB a commitment to sector-based disclosure and a complete set of investor-oriented sector-based standards. So those standards haven't in their entirety, S2 is somewhat different, but they haven't in their entirety gone through our due processing, and we don't have ISSB sector standards as such, and indeed are yet to determine the architecture within which we will have those. And critically, there's a sort of overriding requirement in S1 and S2 to provide material information for investors. So we don't say you must disclose A, B, and C. We say if you know, suppose it's a target. We don't say you must disclose a target for emissions, or you must disclose a commitment to 1.5 degrees and a transition plan that fits that commitment, and so on. We say if you have a target and if you have a transition plan, you must disclose. So it's always material information, and this applies also at the industry-based level. So the focus is on what are the key climate-related metrics and disclosures that relate to your industry that allow comparison within your industry, because of course transition varies enormously across different sectors of the economy. Caroline will say more about the emissions themselves, so I'll go on to the next slide. We have promised to provide guidance in one way or another. There's application guidance and accompanying guidance in the standard itself. There's a board paper coming to our board meeting next week on recommending the development of further educational material around S2 to be developed between now and the end of the year. So as I think was it Peter? What somebody just mentioned a while ago, standard setting is an ongoing process, right? And this is very much the case for S2 as well. S2 is a start and will be developed over time in line with market practice. I think that might be my final slide, Caroline, and then I'll hand over to you.
I think that's right. Thank you. So if you could go, yeah, perfect. So it's lovely to be here. It is my first time here, but obviously been working with you for quite some time. So it's really, really exciting to be here. I will have the pleasure of talking a bit more about the greenhouse gas emission requirements, which I hopefully just further tease up for the analysis that I know will be presented after this. So if we go to the next slide, please. So S2 requires a company to disclose its absolute scope 1, 2, and 3 gross greenhouse gas emissions. And when the ISSB consulted on these requirements, there was broad agreement among stakeholders, in particular investors, that greenhouse gas emission information is necessary to understand the climate-related transition risks a company is exposed to, such as the risks associated with new or strengthening regulation around GHG emissions in certain markets. That means that it will be necessary to adjust the way the business is run to address this. The emissions must be measured in accordance with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard. However, there is some relief first. So if a jurisdiction requires a company to use a different approach to measurement, then that's then okay, and there's a relief there. And also there's a transition relief. So if a company is using a different measurement method at the moment, it is permitted to use that method in its first year of applying the standard. And this is intended to assist companies when starting to use the standards. It might be helpful to highlight that for scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, companies are required to use a location-based approach to disclose information about any contractual instruments that is necessary to inform users' understanding. So this may include disclosing information about market-based scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions as part of meeting that disclosure. So if you go to the next slide, please. The requirement to disclose scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions reflects the importance of providing information related to a company's value chain, as Richard was speaking about earlier, to more fully inform investors' understanding of a company's exposure to transition risks. In response to the ISSB's public consultation, investors communicated that scope 3 emission disclosures is important for understanding climate-related risks and opportunities in a company's value chain, particularly because this usually presents a majority of a company's emissions. As part of IFRS S2, a company must consider the 15 categories of scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions set out in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate value chain standard, with information being disclosed when material. The 15 categories are, as you know, there to help companies with a systematic framework to organize, understand, and report on the diversity of Scope 3 activities, and include categories such as purchased goods and services and use of products sold. And it also includes category 15, investment. So if we go to the next slide, S2 requires companies with activities in asset management, commercial banking, or insurance to disclose information about their financed emissions. In other words, the emissions that banks and investors finance through the loans and commitments. This includes information about a company's absolute gross financed emissions, disaggregated by Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and information about the industry's finances provided to. So we go to the next slide. So Richard spoke a little bit earlier about some of the reliefs and developments since the exposure draft, and this is another area where there's been some developments since the exposure draft. So one of the things that was heard was, Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions will often require the use of estimation, but the feedback also kind of emphasized that despite the measurement uncertainties, it is useful to have those estimates about a company's Scope 3 GHG emissions. So there's a strong message of something is good and we all recognize that this is a journey. And the standard introduced a number of reliefs to support companies. In the interest of time, I think the two things I really want to emphasize, one is that companies are not required to disclose its Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions in the first year of applying IFRS S2, but they are of course permitted to disclose such information. And the other one is a Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions measurement framework that incorporates this use of estimation, and which I will talk to now if we go to the next slide, please. So the ISSB developed a Scope 3 measurement framework to provide additional guidance about the relevant information to use in measuring Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, which, as mentioned previously, often will include the use of estimation. So the framework does not specify the inputs a company is required to use to measure its Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Instead, it requires a company to prioritize inputs that are most likely to enable a representative measurement of a company's Scope 3. So for example, whilst data from specific activities within the value chain, which is often referred to primary data, and which you can see in the second row here, is what a company is required to prioritize, the framework also acknowledges and help entities consider the secondary data that it could use if the primary data is not available, which could include the use of industry-based averages. The standard clarifies that a company is required to use all reasonable and supportable information that is available without undue cost or effort. In other words, in prioritizing information, a company is not required to use undue cost or effort in obtaining that information. Prioritization also implies trade-offs. So it might be, for example, possible to get more granular data that is based on research that is less recent, and more recent data that lacks the same level of granularity. And the framework helps lay out some of these considerations. And just before I finish off, I thought I should mention that in developing this framework, the ISSB built on concepts and considerations laid out in Chapter 7 of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Value Chain Standard. So these concepts should be familiar concepts to preparers already. So I think that is it from our side, unless Richard, you have any final words of wisdom to add to that? No? Right.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I see Deborah has her hand up, but I'm going to just pass over to Lara now, because we may go, I think it perhaps makes sense to go through Lara's presentation and then take questions at the end, if that's all right with everyone.
Yeah, that sounds good from our side.
Lara?
Yes, thank you, Carol. Can we go on to the next slide? Good. So what I will be doing next is walking you through the approach that we take in our GRI 305 emission standard to GHG emissions reporting. And then I will present the outcome of an analysis that we have done comparing the two approaches in IFRS and GRI. And for this session, I'm also joined by my colleagues in the GRI Standards Division, Harold Powells and Margherita Barbieri, who are leading the review of our climate standard. currently. Good. So in GRI 305, our emissions standard from 2016, we have 3 disclosures covering the 3 scopes of GHG emissions. And these 3 disclosures are based on the requirements of the GHG protocol, both the corporate standard and the value chain standard. In the Scope 1 disclosure, we are asking for the gross Scope 1 emissions in metric tons of CO2 equivalent, and we ask companies to specify the gases that they have included in the calculation. And for that, we refer to the 7 gases of the Kyoto Protocol. We also ask companies to report biogenic CO2 emissions separately. And then we ask for a number of contextual information about the Scope 1 emissions. For example, the base year, including the emissions in the base year, the emissions factors, the global warming potential rates, the consolidation approach in line with the GHG protocol, and the standards, methodologies, assumptions, and calculations tools. We also include a number of instructions for compiling the Scope 1 emissions, for example, excluding GHG traits from the calculation and other instructions relating to reporting biogenic emissions. Next slide, please. Then for Scope 2, as well as for Scope 3, you will see that there are a number of requirements that are identical to Scope 1. So I will not go through those again, but you see those highlighted in a different color on the slides. But what is particular about Scope 2 is that we are asking for 2 different figures, the location-based Scope 2 emissions, and if applicable, the market-based Scope 2 emissions, which is in line with the GHG protocol Scope 2 guidance. Next slide. And then for Scope 3, we're asking for 1 total figure of the Scope 3 emissions. And then we're asking companies to indicate which Scope 3 categories and activities have been included in the calculation of the Scope 3 emissions. And similarly to Scope 1, we're asking for the biogenic CO2 emissions to be reported separately. Next slide, please. Good. So that was a quick overview. And next, what I will do is I will walk you in a little bit more detail comparing the 2 approaches to the scope disclosures in GRI and IFRS. Just a few things to note about the analysis that we have done. This is just a high-level analysis, and we have focused primarily on comparing the requirements across the 2 sets of standards. So we don't go into other elements of the standards, like, for example, guidance. And also important to note that the analysis we're presenting is based on our existing standard from 2016, which is currently being used by companies. But as you know, we are currently revising that standard, and some of the requirements could potentially change in the future. Next slide, please. Good. So next, we're going to have a look at a number of items that are cross-cutting and that apply to all 3 scope disclosures. So the first thing to note is that both standards require reporting Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions using the same unit of measurement. IFRS asks to include all 7 gases in the calculation of the 3 scopes, and GRI requires to report which gases have been included in the calculation. We refer to the same 7 gases, but we don't require that all 7 gases be included in the calculation as such. Then IFRS requires removal efforts to be excluded from the calculation of the emissions, and GRI requires to exclude GHG traits from the calculation. IFRS includes some instructions on what to do in cases where entities in the value chain use different reporting periods than the reporting entity, and that's something that is not currently covered in GRI. For the global warming potential rates, IFRS requires using those based on a 100-year time horizon from the latest IPCC report. And GRI recommends but does not require using those rates. Instead, we require reporting the rates that have been used and the source of those rates. On emission factors, IFRS requires reporting the emissions factors, and GRI requires reporting the source of the emission factors, but not the factors as such. On emission factors, also IFRS requires using emission factors that best represent the entity's activity, and GRI recommends applying emission factors consistently for the data disclosed. On the base year, IFRS requires reporting the base period in the context of reporting on targets, and GRI requires reporting the base year for every scope disclosure, irrespective of setting any targets. And it requires a few additional data points, such as the emissions in the base year, the rationale for choosing it, and so on. Next slide, please. Good. When it comes to normative documents, IFRS requires using the GHG protocol corporate standard in order to measure GHG emissions, and it allows using a different method when it is required by a jurisdictional authority or an exchange where the entity is listed. GRI does not require any specific accounting standard to be used. A company is free to choose whichever standard they deem appropriate, but as mentioned, the GHG protocol is at the basis of our disclosures, and we know that many GRI reporters use the GHG protocol for accounting their emissions. Both standards ask for information about the approach taken to measure GHG emissions. IFRS asks about the measurement approach, inputs and assumptions used, and the reasons for choosing them, as well as any changes to those and the reasons for those changes. And GRI asks for the standards, methodologies, assumptions, and calculation tools used. Then for Scope 1 and Scope 2, both standards allow choosing between the equity, share, and the control approaches in the GHG protocol. And IFRS additionally asks about the reason for choosing a specific consolidation approach. And also for Scope 1 and Scope 2, IFRS requires disaggregating emissions between the consolidated accounting group and other investees, which is something that is not required in GRI. Next slide, please. Then for Scope 1, the only other thing to highlight is that GRI requires reporting biogenic CO2 emissions separately, which is not required in IFRS. Next slide. For Scope 2, both standards require reporting the location-based Scope 2 emissions. Then GRI also requires, if applicable, to report the market-based Scope 2 emissions, which are not required under IFRS, but it is suggested that companies may wish to disclose the market-based Scope 2 emissions. Instead, IFRS requires entities to provide information about their contractual instruments if that provides useful information on their Scope 2 emissions. Next slide, please. And on Scope 3, both standards require reporting which Scope 3 categories have been included in the calculation of Scope 3. And IFRS specifically requires using the 15 categories of the GHG protocol value chain standard. GRI does not require those 15 specific categories, but we do refer to them in the guidance to that disclosure, and we suggest that companies can use that. Then IFRS includes 3 different additional requirements which are not covered under GRI. Those include on when to reassess Scope 3 categories and entities in the value chain, how to prioritize the use of inputs for calculating Scope 3 emissions, and reporting financed emissions for those entities with activities in asset management, commercial banking, and insurance. Under GRI, financed emissions can be reported as part of the total Scope 3 emissions, but it is not required to be for that to be reported separately. And finally, on Scope 3, similar to Scope 1, GRI requires reporting the biogenic emissions of CO2 separately, and that is not required under the IFRS S2 standard. Good, so I will leave it at that and then turn it over to everyone for questions and discussion, and also happy for the ISSB colleagues to follow up with any remarks to the analysis that we have just presented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lara. So we have questions from anybody to anybody, if that's required. So Deborah, did you still have a question? You had your hand up earlier. And
yes, I do. I guess my question is really around the Scope 3. I think that probably introduces the most amount of variability between companies, because there's quite a bit of, I'd say, scope within the greenhouse gas protocol in terms of what Scope 3 category should be reported on. And I understand, obviously, it's based on materiality, but just maybe it's a question for the IFRS. Is there any thought on sort of when you go down to the sector level to provide further guidance on the types of Scope 3 categories that should be reported on based on the sector that you're in? Obviously, the guidance has been for the financial industry to report on the financed emissions, but wondering if there is going to be a bit more guidance for other companies.
Yeah, so the brief answer to that is yes. So the climate related components of the SASB standards were extracted from the SASB standards and exposed along with the ED for the rest of S2. And so the requirement is to look at the SASB standards, and there's in effect a presumption of applying them, but an overriding requirement of only reporting waste material, whether that's in the SASB standards or not. But there is a requirement for sector level, industry level disclosure. Did you want to add to that, Caroline?
Well, maybe just to kind of really build on that, Richard, one of the things that you won't see necessarily in the industry-based guidance is the word Scope 3, because it's much more thinking about the levers, but I think it can still be quite a good starting point to see what is, so if you're a auto manufacturer, the metrics that you'll be looking at in the industry-based guidance include things like electric vehicles, a percentage of your fleet is electric vehicles, apologies, which gives you an indication. And there's a working paper that SASB published back in the days on kind of Scope 1, 2, and 3 and how that's used in the industry-based material. And this can kind of help think about, well, what are the relevant kind of categories that I would be looking at when measuring my Scope 3 GHG emissions.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much for this detailed presentation. It was actually very helpful to look at the two side by side. So thank you for that.
Lara did most of the work on the comparison. That's where the credit needs to go.
The team did. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. And Anna,
yes, thank you. I have two questions. One of my questions is on Scope 2 and the fact that the location-based emissions are required under ISSB's standard, and the market-based emissions are handled more on a as needed basis if the contracts are available. I believe most companies' emission reduction goals these days are set based on market-based emissions. How do you anticipate companies being able to report on the progress they make toward these goals if the market-based emissions are not required? How do the users of the information would be reconciling the location versus the targets being set on a different number? Have you given that a thought?
So just so I can come in here first, Richard, I'm happy to hear more because I know that you guys had a very avid discussion around the board table for market-based and location-based in December. But the thing that makes all of these sort of mappings quite difficult is that the standards are principle-based and they're interrelated, and there are other requirements that might affect the disclosure of certain information. And what I mean practically in this sense is that there is a requirement to disclose any targets that a company has set. And if you therefore have target, and then also to disclose information that enable users to understand the progress towards that target. So if you have a target to reduce your emissions through the use of contractual instruments with scope 2 GHG emissions, then it might be that it's relevant to actually disclose that as part of that requirement. So that's kind of one part of it. The other part was, and this is where I'm going to look to Richard to kind of come in a moment, but the other part that was discussed around the board table was the analogy between net and gross emissions, and the fact that when we look at any disclosure on net emission, we typically focus on information to help users understand that, and it's typically around targets again, actually, and sort of the use of planned use of carbon offsetting for carbon credits, and so on. And in that analogy, it was felt that actually location-based is the one that's, and users came with various feedback, but is most helpful to understand the current emission footprint, but having that information, not just about what is the net equivalent, what is a market-based number, but also how is the company thinking about that, what other information is relevant, and kind of focus more on the sort of holistic view rather than just kind of giving two numbers to users. So it wasn't to preclude market-based disclosures, it was to make sure that the information was presented kind of more holistically. How's the company thinking about it? If they have contractual instruments, what do they look like? And so on. So Richard, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Not really. I mean, the overriding requirement to report information that's material applies to everything, right? So if any given metric is important but is not required, then not sort of called out as required, it is nevertheless implicitly required. If you see what I mean. So it's not. So it's not
although then the location-based emissions are sort of given a bit of a preference because they are required, and then on top of that, you could include other information, which I think creates.
I think we need to be careful.
The location-based emission.
I see what you're saying, and it's definitely something that I've heard as an interpretation. But what is required is the disclosure of the location-based emissions, as well as any other or information about contractual instruments, which may include market-based. So the information is required and given prominence. I think it's not that different to saying if relevant. So if you have contractual instruments and they provide useful information to investors, that is explicitly written in the standard.
Great, thank you. And my other question is on global warming potential factors and a requirement to use the latest IPCC report, which would make it quite difficult, I think, for reporters, because most companies use publicly available databases such as BASE, or formerly DEFRA, or IEA for electricity factors, which all use a fourth report. Do you have a suggestion on where the reporters then would go and look for the emission factors to compile their inventories in compliance with your requirement?
Yeah, sorry, I'm so glad you asked that, because it's such a small little geeky point that we have in our standard, and we don't necessarily highlight on any presentation because I'm worried people won't necessarily follow it so much. But there is actually some application guidance around the global warming potential, which says that because the requirement is also that a company needs to use the most relevant emission factors available, sometimes that may be or in governance sources and other kind of pre-calculated emission factors. And in those instances, the entity is not required to recalculate the emission factors using the latest global warming potential, but can use the ones that are already baked in. So if you're interested to really dig into the detail, you can find this in B20 to B22 in the application guidance of IFRS S2.
So it's not in S2 itself, but in the application guide.
In the application
So,
guidance,
yeah, it would be
yes.
great to have that reference because I can anticipate people asking. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll write that in the chat as well.
Thanks, Caroline. That's all from me. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any further questions or observations? Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us and for your presentation, and thank you very much to Laura and the team for preparing the work on the comparison between the way that GRI 305 calculates the emissions and the disclosures on those scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions compared to the IFRS S2 disclosures. It would seem to me that there is not a lot of difference there. I don't know whether that would be your conclusion as well, Harold. Put you on the spot.
No problem, thank you, Carol. Well, it's too early to say in our current revision, and also Margarita can say, but of course our objective is to align wherever possible. It's I think where the difference will be is mainly where Richard started with is on the materiality aspect, from also looking not only from an investor perspective but from all a multi-stakeholder approach. But especially scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, we are using the greenhouse gas protocol as a strong reference. They are in our committee, we work very much together. So yeah, it's too early to say, but I on my own personal opinion, I would say we should be able to align pretty much there the baselines for that, so that's good for any organization. But there will be differences, especially on the other aspects, which are less, you could say, more difficult to understand from a multi-stakeholder perspective. Let's say it like that, and there will be differences. So, anything to add, Margarita, as project lead?
Thank you, Harold. For now, it's good. Like as it was said, like we're going under the revision of the standard, so we are taking the interoperability goal as part of the content development. I'm sure there will be chances in the next months to connect on specific phases for to show the work that we are doing. For now, I think there is nothing to specific to be added to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, so and Carol, I think from the GSB perspective, you also say question to us is probably to stay in close contact with ISB on this, and that's what we do, to make sure there are no gaps which are not understandable from a user perspective. I mean that's I think most important one, and we will do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to Richard, Suzanne and Caroline for joining us, and thank you to Lara and the team again for your for the comparison and your presentation.
Thank you
so
for
that
inviting us,
concludes. You're very welcome. And so that concludes that part of the meeting and just takes us to any other business now. I think if you could move the slides on, Julian, please, to make sure I haven't missed anything. Yes, is there any other business? No, okay, so that includes the public part of the meeting. Thank you all for joining us on that.